The first time people call the Forbidden City haunted, it usually sounds like a joke. Not a serious warning, not a confession. A casual line said with a half-smile. The way someone speaks about a place they refuse to enter alone after dark. And then if you ask why, the smile fades a little. Because the answer isn't ghosts. The answer is history. The Forbidden City sits in the center of Beijing like a sealed heart. From the outside, it looks like order turned into architecture. Red walls that don't apologize for being tall, golden roofs that catch the sun like a crown, courtyards arranged so precisely you feel guided even when no one is guiding you. In daylight, it's too clean, too ceremonial, too confident. You can stand there and believe the story the palace wants to tell. This is a monument, preserved and controlled, a world that ended and stayed ended. But there's an old habit people learn around places like this. They lower their voice without noticing. Not because someone told them to, but because the space demands it. Because the air inside those walls feels like it has rules. Locals describe it as energy, heavy and settled, as if darkness here isn't just the absence of light, but a presence of its own. And whether you believe in that or not, the sensation is easy to imagine. The way old stone holds cold. The way narrow corridors trap sound. The way your footsteps suddenly feel too loud, too personal. Now imagine the palace after closing. The tourists are gone. The souvenir stands are quiet. The wide courtyards that looked harmless at noon become empty bowls under the night sky. A wind moves through carved beams and old frames, and it doesn't sound like wind in a new building. It sounds like something searching. That is where the stories begin. Not with a monster. Not with a scream. With a small moment when a person realizes, for the first time, that silence can feel crowded. A guard walks his route and hears a second set of footsteps behind him. He stops. The footsteps stop. He turns, and there is no one in the courtyard. He keeps walking anyway because a job is a job. But he does it faster now. When he reaches the next corridor, he sees a flicker of light ahead. Just once. As if someone cupped a flame in their hand and hit it again. That guard doesn't call it a ghost. Not yet. He calls it stress, fatigue, a trick of the eyes. But the next night he hears it again. The same echo, the same pause, the same feeling that the palace is listening. And in a place like this, repetition turns fear into belief. For more than 600 years, the Forbidden City was not simply a home. It was a machine built to produce obedience. It held thousands of lives inside its walls. Emperors guarded by ritual, concubines whose futures depended on a glance, eunuchs who survived by becoming invisible, maids who learned to walk softly and never asked questions, guards who watched everything and still understood almost nothing. When people talk about hauntings here, they usually jump straight to dramatic images. Faceless women in corridors, crying near ancient gates, a cold pressure around the throat. But those images don't appear out of nowhere. They grow in the soil the palace created. Because obedience meant you didn't speak freely. Obedience meant you didn't repeat what you heard. Obedience meant you didn't look too closely at a person who was crying, because tomorrow they might be gone, and you would be expected to behave as if they never existed. It's easy to say people died here. People die everywhere. What makes this palace different is how it handled death. The Forbidden City didn't allow messy grief. It didn't allow explanations. It didn't allow closure. It allowed silence. And then it moved on. That is the kind of place where ghost stories are born. Not because spirits enjoy drama, but because too many endings happened without witnesses. And the earliest stories were not told by outsiders. They were told by the people trapped inside the palace's rules, told in fragments. The way you share information when you don't trust the walls. There was a way servants would talk about certain corridors without naming them directly. A glance, a small shake of the head, a warning spoken like a prayer, don't go there late. Among the voices that later made these rumors feel less like fantasy and more like confession was Puyi, the last emperor of China. Puyi matters because he was born into the palace's logic. He didn't arrive as a curious visitor. He grew up in a world where the palace was the universe. He was surrounded by ceremonial language, strict hierarchy, and constant supervision. The kind of upbringing that teaches you to accept the impossible as normal and to hide fear the way you hide a mistake. Later, Puyi wrote his memoir, The First Half of My Life, and he implied something that still unsettles readers. The Forbidden City was already full of strange stories when he lived there, rumors, whispers, accounts of things that didn't fit into the palace's rules. One line attributed to his recollections is repeated often. He suggested that if he wrote down every ghost story he had heard or experienced inside the palace, the book would become unbelievably thick. That sentence doesn't sound like a scream. It sounds like resignation, like a man looking back on a place that shaped him and admitting that even he could not fully explain what it did to the people inside. By the time Puyi became emperor, the Forbidden City had already stood for nearly 500 years. That means the palace had already accumulated centuries of fear before he ever arrived. And fear, when it lasts long enough, becomes tradition. It becomes a pattern people follow without knowing why. During the day, the Forbidden City looked grand and majestic, but people inside said that once night fell, it became eerily silent. Corridors stretched like a maze. Wind slipped through old cracks and moved across the floor with a soft scrape, as if fabric brushed stone. Lantern flames trembled, and the shadows they cast did not sit still. They crawled across the walls, lengthening and shrinking, and every movement invited the same question. Is the shadow only the shadow of the lantern, or is it something standing just out of sight? Here is where the palace stories stop being general and become specific, because different tellers, different years, and different mouths return to the same locations, as if the building itself is pointing to particular wounds. Puyi mentioned an area on the eastern side of the palace, a narrow passageway, the kind of space that forces you to walk close to the wall, close to the shadows. People said that if you walked through it late at night, you would suddenly feel something cold around your neck, tightening so fast you could barely breathe. In the best versions of this story, the fear doesn't explode immediately. It creeps in. You step into the passage. The air changes as if you entered a cellar. The hairs on your arms rise. You tell yourself it's just a draft. Then you feel the pressure. Not a touch you can see, not a hand you can grab, a tightening around your throat that makes your body freeze before your mind understands what's happening. Your first instinct is not to scream. It is to obey, to stand still, to stop moving, because something in you believes movement will make it worse. And then it releases, just enough for you to breathe. And what do you do next? You don't run to report it. In a palace built on silence, the safest response is always the same: pretend nothing happened. Near that passageway, another location gathered its own reputation, an old gateway linked to punishment, especially punishment of palace maids. Years later, people claimed they could still hear women crying near it. Not screaming, not theatrical wailing, crying that sounded tired and thin, as if the voice had been crying for a long time and had lost the energy to be dramatic. People said the sound didn't echo like a normal voice in an open courtyard. It sounded as if it came from inside the walls, as if the architecture itself had absorbed it and learned how to repeat it. A guard hears it once and tells himself it's an animal, a cat, a bird, the wind. Then he hears it again, and this time it seems closer. Then on another night, he hears it while standing beside the gate, and when he moves away, the crying follows for a few seconds before fading, like a memory refusing to let him leave. That is how the palace teaches fear, slowly, with small confirmations. And then there is the well. Inside the Forbidden City, an ancient well is surrounded by tales that feel heavier than the others. Even without legend, a well is unsettling. You can't see the bottom clearly. You can't measure its depth with your eyes. You can drop a pebble and wait for the sound, and the waiting itself becomes a kind of dread. The legend says this well became connected to wronged women, that something ended there in a way that never received justice, that the well wasn't merely a structure, but a mouth the palace used to swallow what it didn't want to explain. According to rumor, the well was covered with a heavy iron plate, and no one was allowed to go near, not because of safety, but because of fear, because people believed the well held more than water. And of course, the story became a dare. They said that if someone knocked on the iron lid at midnight, before dawn either they or someone close to them would fall ill, or they would dream of being dragged down into the dark water. Not a random nightmare, but a specific dream told in almost the same language across retellings. Black water, a sudden pull, hands from below that do not show themselves fully, but make their intention clear. Maybe it's superstition. Maybe it's suggestion. Maybe it's the mind reacting to a story it's been fed. But the well created a rule, and palace rules are powerful. They shape behavior, they shape routes. They decide who walks alone and who refuses to. A place that everyone avoids becomes a place where you are more likely to be alone. And if you are alone, every sensation becomes louder, every sound becomes personal. That is why the Forbidden City stories weren't entertainment. They were survival. And at the time, the palace was closed to outsiders. These rumors lived inside the walls among servants and guards, people who had no reason to invent drama for fun. In that world, telling a ghost story wasn't a hobby. It was a warning disguised as a whisper. But time changed the empire. The Qing dynasty fell. The Forbidden City became a museum. Doors once guarded by ritual became doors tourists lined up to photograph. Courtyards once filled with politics became places where people took selfies. And yet, the legends didn't die. They changed their witnesses. Because when the palace became public, the daytime belonged to visitors. The night still belonged to workers, security guards, cleaners, patrol officers, people who walked the courtyards when the crowds vanished and the palace returned to its preferred state. Quiet. Those workers kept reporting strange experiences. Footsteps echoing through empty spaces, lights flickering in rooms that were supposed to be sealed, the soft rustle of silk behind closed doors, like someone moving in clothes nobody wears anymore. And in the staff stories, one image repeats like a signature. A woman dressed in old dynastic clothing, carrying a small lantern, walking slowly down a corridor. Guards described the light from her lantern flickering faintly in the wind. They said that when they tried to follow her, she vanished in an instant, not running away, not hiding, simply no longer there, as if the corridor swallowed her. Some of them described the same lingering impression afterward. The corridor felt occupied even when it was empty, like the palace had allowed them to see something for 1 second, just to remind them who truly controlled the night. This is where the Forbidden City's haunting becomes more than scattered scary claims. It becomes a question. If the palace can hold silence for centuries, can it also hold impressions? Can it hold old scenes the way walls hold heat? Can it replay something under the right conditions, the way memory replays at the worst possible time? Because that question is exactly what explodes into the most famous legend of all, the one people still argue about decades later. It begins with a modern crowd, a sudden storm, lightning over the palace rooftops, and a red wall that, according to witnesses, showed something it should not have been able to show. And if that story is even half true, it means the Forbidden City isn't just haunted by what happened inside it. It may be haunted by the past itself, refusing to stay buried. If Chapter 1 is about why the Forbidden City attracts hauntings, this chapter is about the moment the legend escaped its walls. For most of its existence, the palace kept its stories private. It was closed, guarded, sealed away from outsiders. Even if something strange happened, it happened among people trained to stay silent. But in the summer of 1992, the rumor says the palace did something different. It showed itself, not to a single guard, not to one exhausted worker alone in a corridor, to a crowd. And that is why people still argue about it today. They call it the 1992 Forbidden City incident. Some dismiss it as mass hysteria. Some insist it was real. And some claim it was neither ghost nor hallucination, something closer to the past leaking into the present for a few seconds. It begins as an ordinary day. The palace is open. Visitors move through courtyards with cameras and bottled water, thinking about dynasties and architecture, not about the supernatural. The Forbidden City looks exactly like what it is supposed to look like. History behind walls, controlled and safe. Then the weather changes. The sky turns fast, as summer storms often do. One moment it's bright. The next, clouds gather like a lid closing. The air thickens. Thunder starts far away, then comes closer until it feels as if it's rolling directly above the palace roofs. People react the way crowds always do. They speed up. They cluster. They look for shelter under eaves, in gateways, and in long corridors where the stone ceiling suddenly feels like protection. Then the lightning begins. Not one flash, but repeated bursts bright enough to turn the palace into a sharp, unnatural photograph again and again. Red walls, gold tiles, black silhouettes, the sky cracking open over ancient rooftops, as if the storm is trying to expose something. According to the legend, that is when the impossible appears. A group of tourists near a red palace wall saw a line of women walking slowly beside it. Not modern women, women dressed in traditional palace robes, in clothing that belonged to another era. Witnesses said the figures moved in a calm line, as if time around them was running differently. Some said they seemed to be quietly talking to one another, the way people do when they're walking somewhere familiar. Some versions include details that make the story feel painfully human. One man reportedly laughed at first, not because he thought it was funny, but because the brain sometimes laughs when it doesn't know what else to do. He pointed at the wall and said something like, "Is this some kind of show?" Then another lightning flash hit, and the laughter died in his throat. Another witness, a woman standing under the eaves, allegedly grabbed her friend's sleeve so hard her nails left marks through wet fabric. She didn't scream. She didn't speak. She just stared wide-eyed, as if she was afraid that blinking would make the figures disappear and prove she imagined them. Different tellers argue about small details, but the core image stays the same. Traditional robes, fluttering sleeves, slow steps, and faces that looked pale, almost drained of color, like the life in them had been turned down. The movement is what makes the story feel wrong. People didn't describe the women as moving naturally through heavy rain. They described the scene like it had a strange frame rate, like an old film being played too slowly, every gesture slightly delayed from reality. The crowd reacted in different ways. Some froze, unable to decide whether what they were seeing was real. Some screamed and ran the way the body runs before the mind can explain. And some did what people always do when the world stops making sense. They tried to record it. It was 1992. Cameras used film. Rain was heavy, lightning constant, hands shaking. Even if you managed to take a photo, you wouldn't know what you captured until later, after development. The legend says that when the photos were developed, they were disturbing but unclear, blurred images, washed-out shapes, faint human outlines drifting across the frame. Nothing sharp enough to convince a skeptic, and nothing empty enough to comfort someone who had been there. That's the point where a rumor becomes dangerous. Because once there is even the possibility of evidence, people stop treating a story as entertainment. They start treating it like a problem. The Forbidden City isn't just a tourist destination, it's a national symbol. A public haunting attached to it isn't only scary, it's embarrassing, disruptive, and impossible to control. So the story says an explanation followed. A scientific explanation. The claim was that the red walls were painted with pigments containing iron compounds, often described as ferric oxide. Under heavy rain and intense electrical activity, the wall might briefly behave like photographic film, recording and then replaying an image. So what the tourists saw wasn't real people. It was an old imprint reactivated by the storm. On paper, it's neat. It uses the language of science, the language that calms people down because it turns fear into a formula. But the more you examine it, the more it feels like the kind of explanation made for crowds rather than for truth. Because walls are not film. Film is engineered to react to light. It's protected, stored, handled carefully. The Forbidden City's walls have been repainted, repaired, restored, layered over decades and centuries. Even if a strange reaction could occur, how would any image survive maintenance, weather, and time? And even if an imprint survived, why would it appear as motion? A smear of light might be plausible. A vague shadow, maybe. But a line of women walking, sleeves moving, figures seemingly speaking? Motion isn't a photograph. Motion is time. So skeptics propose alternatives. Some point to perception under stress. A storm, lightning flashes, a crowded corridor, adrenaline in the body. The brain wants to complete the picture, and once one person reacts, others may interpret the same shadows in the same way. Others point to optics, wet surfaces acting like mirrors, sudden flashes creating reflections, raindrops distorting outlines, the wall turning into a temporary screen for the wrong kind of light. Those explanations sound more realistic, and yet none of them fully erases the detail that keeps the legend alive. Multiple people claim to see the same thing at the same moment, in the same direction, reacting before anyone had time to suggest an image to the others. That's why the story doesn't settle into a single category. It sits between possibilities, and that is where fear lasts the longest. Then comes the final element that keeps the rumor breathing, the missing negatives. According to the legend, the original film negatives were never found. Some say they were confiscated to stop the rumor from growing. Others say there were never negatives at all, and the absence is just a convenient feature of an urban legend. But notice how the story traps you either way. If the negatives never existed, the incident can't be proven. If the negatives were taken, the incident can't be disproven. The rumor becomes a closed room, and the key is always missing. And that is why people keep repeating it. Not because everyone believes it was a ghost parade, but because the Forbidden City is the kind of place where the idea of a replayed past feels almost reasonable. A palace designed for secrecy, built on silence, filled with human lives that ended without closure. If any place could hold impressions like fingerprints in stone, it would be this one. Which leads to the question that makes workers fear the palace more than tourists ever will. If the palace could show the past to a crowd during a storm, what could it do to one person alone at night? Because the next stories are not about a wall. They're about the palace touching a living body, moving a sleeping man without waking him, and letting laughter slip through a sealed door. And those stories don't need lightning to be terrifying. They only need the kind of silence the Forbidden City has perfected for centuries. By the time the Forbidden City became a museum, the legends didn't disappear. They simply changed uniforms. The daytime belonged to tourists and sunlight. The nighttime belonged to the people whose job it was to stay inside after the gates closed: security, cleaners, patrol. And in the 1980s, the palace still had its own fire brigade, men responsible for prevention, drills, and night rounds through halls that were never built to feel comforting. Beijing summers can be heavy and exhausting. After training, sometimes the men chose convenience over comfort. Instead of walking back to their dormitory, they laid thin mats on the stone floors of a side hall and slept there until morning. The stone stayed cool, and the hall felt safe enough in the simplest way. It had walls, a roof, and nothing moving inside it. Until one night when one of them woke up around 2 a.m., shivering from a cold that didn't fit the season. At first he thought it was just sweat cooling on his skin. He tried to roll over, to pull his mat closer, and then he realized something was wrong. He wasn't inside the hall. He was outside in the corridor, fully out, as if someone had carried him neatly and placed him there. The courtyard around him was silent. The air felt empty in the way large places feel empty at night, like the darkness has room to breathe. His first thought wasn't a ghost. It was anger. He assumed his teammates were playing a cruel prank. So he got up, grabbed his mat, dragged it back inside the hall, and lay down again, determined not to let anyone mess with him a second time. Morning came. He opened his eyes, and he was outside again. Same corridor, same position, same impossible neatness, like the hall had rejected him in his sleep and returned him to the walkway the way a body returns a splinter. This time he didn't shout. He didn't laugh it off. He went straight to the others and demanded the truth. They swore they didn't touch him, and one of them added the detail that changed everything. He said he heard him talking in his sleep. Not mumbling, not groaning, talking, as if a conversation was happening in the dark beside him, the kind of low speech you use when you don't want to wake anyone else. The man who kept waking in the corridor felt his stomach drop, because there was only one possible response. If nobody carried him out, then something else did. After that, the story says no one dared to sleep in that hall again. Some believed the hall was tied to an old injustice, a place where someone had died wronged and forgotten. Others blamed the palace's heavying energy, the idea that certain corners of the Forbidden City become dense with something unseen, and that some people are more easily affected than others. Whatever the explanation, the result was the same. A place that had seemed harmless became a place the living avoided. And that avoidance is how the Forbidden City stays powerful. It doesn't need to chase you. It only needs to teach you where not to go. But the most disturbing legends in this palace don't end with a corridor. They end with a name. Consort Jin. Her story lives in the shadow between history and rumor. In many retellings, she was once favored, then condemned, and ordered to die, thrown into a well on the command of Empress Dowager Cixi. Her name became a wound in the palace's memory, because it represents the kind of death that can happen when power wants silence more than truth. After the dynasty fell, former eunuchs and caretakers remained in the Forbidden City. They knew the palace like a second skin. They knew which doors stuck, which corridors carried sound too far, which courtyards felt colder than they should. And one story says that during an evening patrol, a caretaker passed by the old quarters associated with Consort Jin and heard laughter coming from inside a sealed room. Soft laughter, uneven laughter. Sometimes it sounded like a woman. Sometimes it sounded like a man. The caretaker assumed the simplest thing first. Someone had broken in. He moved closer carefully and looked through the window. Inside, in dim flickering light, he saw a woman seated in an old palace gown. Her face looked eerily similar to Consort Jin's portraits. Beside her sat a young man with a braided queue, the hairstyle of a bygone era. They were talking and laughing gently, as if the palace hadn't changed and time outside the window didn't exist. The caretaker froze. Others came running. Together, they forced the door open. The room was empty. No people. No light. No sound. Just stillness. They locked the door and left quickly, telling themselves they had imagined it, that the storm of their own nerves had painted images onto dust and darkness. But later, on the next round, as they passed the same corridor again, the laughter returned, from the same sealed room, clear and unmistakable, as if the palace wasn't trying to scare them, as if it was simply replaying something it refused to bury. This is why the Forbidden City legends feel different from ordinary ghost stories. They don't always behave like a spirit hunting the living. They behave like memory trapped in architecture, like scenes caught inside the palace's silence and triggered again when night is quiet enough to hear them. So when people ask whether the Forbidden City is haunted, maybe the better question is this: is it spirits that remain? Or is it the past itself refusing to stay silent? Because the palace isn't empty. It's quiet. And on certain nights, that quiet feels less like peace and more like attention, as if something behind the red walls is still watching, still counting footsteps, still deciding who belongs inside its corridors and who does not.